Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Week 6 expression session for Crunch. I'm Lisa, and I'm your host for this session. It's great to see a few people from our Crunch crew, especially, and some of the other faces joining us from the wider learning analytics community. Warm welcome to all. For those of you who are just joining us today, Crunch is a subject in UTS's Graduate Certificate in Learning Design, as well as a micro-credential. This subject is an introduction to learning analytics with a special focus on its relevance for learning design. Well, this webinar is part of our core Crunch journey. We love opening these sessions up to share the excitement with anyone who's got an interest in this field. And so today we are delighted to have our guest speaker, Dr. Antonette Shibani, sharing her expertise with us. Shibani is a senior lecturer at UTS in the Transdisciplinary School, and she's also a well-known researcher in the field of writing analytics, particularly in the research and development of the EchoWriter tool. And it's always exciting when we can showcase the incredible expertise we have right on our doorstep. So here's the plan for today. Shibani will take us through her presentation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open things up for a lively Q&A session. As always, don't hold back. Chuck your questions in the chat whenever they pop into your head during the talk. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout, and we'll bring up your questions during the Q&A question time. So fire away. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Shibani for her talk. Shibani, over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for joining. Let me share my screen and make sure that you can see it before we start. Ready. Can you see my slides, okay?
Just seeing, yeah, I've got your slides now.
All right, perfect. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session. Thank you for having me. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about aligning emerging technologies with educational practice and particularly the role of learning design. And when Lisa invited me to do this talk, I was thinking about what's most relevant, given there's quite a lot of work around learning analytics. But I made this title as generic as possible, calling it emerging technologies, because the key here is the focus is not on a particular technology. Tools will keep changing, the capabilities, the very nature is going to change. And it's just that fact that tools are emerging, but some concepts are quite tech agnostic, in particular with educational practice, what works best in educational practice. Some of the foundational aspects of learning design are very, very crucial from what we've learned from research and practice so far. So that will be the focus of my talk. And a bit about myself. So thanks, Lisa, you've already introduced me. I'm a senior lecturer at UTS and also part of the CRETS, which is a center where we have some amazing members doing some work on education in the digital society. So my research is mostly around learning analytics and artificial intelligence in education. I've done quite a lot of work around writing analytics and writing feedback, and more recently around generative AI. And my teaching involves teaching into the Master of Data Science and Innovation program, which you'll notice the relevance a bit later during the talk when I talk about research teaching integration. And I've also been a committee member for the executive committee member of the Society for Learning Analytics Research and hosted some podcasts. So if you're new to learning analytics and want to know some of the basic stuff in a more accessible conversational format, I'd encourage you to check out some of the podcasts that we have in the space. And I'm also the founding member and co-lead of the SOLA Special Interest Group on Writing Analytics. So if you're interested particularly around writing and writing analytics, and I'll talk a little bit about it in my talk later, feel free to get in touch with me as well. And it's my profile, and you can look at all of the research and publications and so forth in that webpage. And there's just one take-home message I want to actually leave you with. as audience of this talk, which is about technology, however powerful it might be, including all of the latest generative AI excitements that we have, should be aligned with learning design for effective learning outcomes in students. So that's what I would like to convey and convince you about. And I'll try and make this case through examples from different contexts. So starting from learning analytics, a bit of a background to learning analytics, and especially talking about this alignment between learning analytics and learning design from this very specific example of writing analytics, the tool that we developed. And then moving on to some more recent work, which I've been doing around generative AI, and how that also needs to align with learning design. So, so starting with learning analytics, you might have already known it's a field that has emerged over the last decade, and it initially started with attempts to tackle huge amounts of data and big data, because we can get a lot of insights from this amounts of data that we can collect. Because data was previously available in educational research, people were using it for many, many years. But a big promise of learning analytics was that it could collect longitudinal data from various levels of granularity, and in authentic learning environments. It doesn't have to be locked in a research lab, for instance. It can come from multiple sources, and it can help learners at scale. So the ability to provide more generalizable solutions and the ability to affect learners at scale was one of the big promises of learning analytics, right? So, but there's always a but. So education by itself is very contextual, meaning there are so many different factors that happen in a classroom. So the instruction, the educator itself, particular setting that it happens, they all influence learning. So the problem is the generalized solutions. They cannot cater to all of the learning contexts because they're very nuanced in some sense. So LA is also ultimately for learners, not just about learners. So with that in mind, so this is also quite a bit of a known proposition in learning analytics, that a one-size-fits-all approach may not work, and we need to, again, bring the focus back into learning. So we do have some cool technologies, analytics, and so forth, but it should, again, tie back to the pedagogical value of learning. And this is just a distinction that I would like to kind of frame it and my thinking about what made the field a little bit distinctive to others. So we, of course, have data. It could come from students, educators, from different kinds of environments, but we ask particular questions. So where it comes from, who uses the data, how are we collecting it? And all of these nuances these are bringing different contexts. They're coming from different contexts. And the approach itself, it's not just a cool methodological tool that we're using, but is it actually valid? Is it useful for the end users? And what kind of learning theory drives it? Is it ethical to ask these questions and collect this data? And in terms of output, again, so what is the output of the work that we do? Is it a tool? Is it some kind of model framework? Is it feedback? And feedback is also a very key part of learning analytics, because it's not just about analyzing and collecting and getting all of the data, but how do we inform the learners back, right? So how does it, again, help them improve their own learning? So all of this happens together in this space. So it's quite an interdisciplinary space, and it crosses a lot of boundaries. So if you actually look at the learning analytics field, and some of the experts in the field, they work in very collaborative teams where you will have psychologists and computer scientists and educators all working together, ethicists and so forth. So that happens. So there's a much larger learning analytics ecosystem to be mindful of, especially when we talk about creating something that is contextual and helpful for the learners. And that's the core for getting impactful learning analytics. So we talk about this in quite a lot of detail in this paper, which is basically this intersection between the social infrastructure and the technical infrastructure. So in the bottom, we do have large computational capacity, the kinds of tools, the user interfaces, and the tech and the systems that we built, but it obviously needs to connect really well and aligned with all of the pedagogical context, the social infrastructure. So that's where learning design comes in. So a little bit back to the this issue of generalizability versus contextualization. So it feels like they seem to contradict each other a little bit in terms of the overall objectives of learning analytics, right? So obviously we want solutions that scale well. So if we are able to teach, say, 800 students, are we able to provide personalized feedback that we never used to do as humans? And that might be possible using learning analytics, and that's an affordance. So we do want to have that kind of generalizable solutions, but we also want something which is contextualized and nuanced, and it can cater to those individual differences in context. So it feels like there's a bit of tension here because it's this usual tension between qualitative approaches and quantitative approaches. So the real issue here is finding this balance between scalability and contextualization for learning analytics. And this also aligns with existing problem in integrating educational technology in practice, because there are a lot of tools where the gap between the potential use and the actual use by students or educators is quite big, because there's a lot of high quality tech which may not get used in practice or vice versa. So and we're not just talking about productivity improvements here, right? So those might work with general purpose tools, like, we all use Microsoft Word and those kinds of general purpose editors. But beyond productivity, what we're targeting here is higher order constructs of learning. And that means here the nuances and the context are really important, because that's how learners can learn better. So how do we bring this context back to learning analytics? There's quite a lot of discussions around context within learning analytics. So, so learning analytics should not from one size fits all. And again, LA for the learning sciences, orchestrating learning analytics, how do we support it at a practitioner level, and informing learning analytics with, aligning learning analytics with learning design. And so there's quite a lot of literature which was developing probably around like 2015, 2016, 18, and so forth, around how we make this alignment very clear. And that's the key here. So how we bring context to LA, and one way is learning design. So we can't just design tools for specific tasks, at least like many years ago, because we did have limited technical capabilities. So we can't build one tool to cater for one specific task. We do need some generalizable solutions or tools, but we still need to make sure that they work for a particular context. And learning design involves designing pedagogical actions. So how do you use those tools or those tasks to help someone learn? So basically designing for learning. So for learning analytics to work effectively, so the best thing is to couple it with those pedagogical approaches. So how do we bring context then is to align it to those pedagogical approaches. And it's not just one way around, right? So it's not just learning design helping learning analytics. It also works vice versa. So for instance, your learning analytics also shapes learning design. So in terms of creating technical affordances, creating platforms, or the way we implement learning design, as well as changes in theory. So sometimes our theoretical context may be different to what actually happens empirically in classrooms. And when you see that in the data, that again informs your learning design. And this is particularly important for student-facing learning analytics tools, where you're putting a tool in front of a student or a learner to use it. And to bring that context and that scale into practice, so we developed this particular model, so presented in the 2019 lab paper, which is called the Contextualizable Learning Analytics Design, or CLAD model. So I'll unpack these elements further. So bit by bit, we'll see. So they're the ones in blue on the left, those are the learning design elements. The ones in orange are the learning analytics elements. So you can see some key people driving them, so educators and learning analytics designers. So assessment is one key part of this CLAD model, because that actually plays a very key role in contextualization, because it needs to align the intended learning outcomes of the curriculum. So if it really is very distant from what students need to produce or need to learn from this particular curriculum, it's going to get very low uptake. So that's been consistently seen in a lot of research. So we need to make sure that there is a constructive alignment between the assessment and the task that students do. So the next learning design component was the task design. So that basically, again, ensures that it's relevant to the learner and it's grounded by some pedagogic theory. So designing activities, right, so that require certain activities for students to do, and those can be implemented with very specific task design. And the learning analytics features, so these are features that a tool would have, for instance. And I'll talk about these with example later, so don't worry if it feels a little bit abstract right now. So features, and then the feedback and UI is what brings the features to the user's attention. So I'm looking at this user interface and I see that this is the feedback that's coming to me. And I'll talk about how these can work together with an example, with this particular example, which is the writing example, which I've been working for quite a bit. So we know that students need support for academic writing. They struggle quite a bit, and it's helpful for them to have formative feedback on their writing. So before they get assessed for it, what if they can get instant 24/7 feedback on their writing at any time? So writing analytics is a subfield that provides this kind of computerized writing support. So that involves the analysis of written text for the purposes of understanding writing products and processes, their context, and provision of automated feedback, formative feedback, again, for educators and students. So for example, like very, very naive or simple common example, Grammarly. So obviously that's a very surface level kind of feature, but that's an example of a tool that provides feedback on someone's writing. And the specific tool I'm going to be talking about is AccuWriter. Some of you might be familiar with reading about this tool. So this is a web-based tool that provides formative feedback on something called rhetorical moves in writing. And it was developed in-house at UTS. It's a research project which turned into a product. I'll also talk about a little bit. There is an open source code base which can also be used by others. And the rhetorical move is a particular unit that performs a communicative function. So for instance, we use certain key phrases or terms in our writing to help the reader follow along the text. So for instance, I might say, in this paper, I will explore, etc., etc. So that means I'm clearly saying, okay, this is what my current work is about. You're signaling to the reader that this is my paper, right? So that's a summary move in AccuWriter. And we might say, recent studies indicate, or while data was previously studied in education research. So here we're talking about background work, something that's been done before in past research. These are examples of rhetorical moves that AccuWriter is finding in text. And we might be using them without even noticing that we are using them, but there's a particular, this is a particular linguistic feature, which is called rhetorical move, and which is what AccuWriter focuses on. And how it does is, I'm not going into the details, but it does something called rhetorical parsing. So it's not just a simple keyword search, but it actually matches them through patterns based on natural language processing rules. And obviously we now have this tool, but again, we come back to this problem of this gap between the potential use of the tool versus the actual use of the tool. So we have a solution that is a tool, it can give some feedback on rhetorical moves, but how do we make it useful for a learner? How does it relate to their educational context? So bringing back CLAT. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense now as we go through it with this writing analytics example. So here, the learning context, I'm going to talk about just one context, just to give you an example. So this context is an undergraduate law subject. So here, students are writing law essays, right? So a particular genre of writing and instructor rubric elements here. So this is the mapping between the assessment, which is the learning design aspect, versus the map to the features of the tool. So the ones here, the essay assessment rubric element, these are defined by the instructor. So the instructor in their assessment usually are looking for engagement with the law and scholarly literature. And they're looking for a statement of thesis or an essay plan. And then they're looking for identification of issues. And these are mapped to what ACCA names them background and summary. So this alignment between the assessment versus the tool's features. And same with the feedback tuning. So the feedback again is contextualized to that particular law essay. So in this law essay, they need to have a background, or they need to have engaged with previous law cases. And that means that if there is a missing background move, ACCA will flag in the feedback that you're missing a background move. So consider including phrases like etc. So again, this feedback is contextualized to that particular context of writing law essays. And the writing task, so this is the task design aspect of it. So we don't simply hand down the tool just for students to go ahead and start using it, because you need quite a bit of orientation towards the tool, how to use it effectively, and what are the other kinds of tasks that go within that designing a particular session. So here, this is just one example of how it was introduced in this subject, where there was an introductory reading or video where the instructor was actually explaining what was happening, why it's important for them to learn about rhetorical moves, how does it relate to the law writing context. There's a lot of introduction and motivation and orientation given to it. And then there's a bit of a matching exercise where they're doing this matching between the rubric and the tool's features, so they actually understand how the tool is going to help them with their writing. Then viewing a sample essay with revisions. So this is instructor's hand revised essay where they are showing what are the different improvements I would have made if I had this essay draft I had. So again, this is learning from examples. And then they were also given a chance to do some self-assessment of a given text, so which was presumably a little bit low quality. They were asked to revise that text with or without ACCA, depending on some of the experimental conditions we were working with. And then they had some peer discussion and feedback survey, and so forth. So you can see how they're actually guided in using the tool, not directly, not just by getting a guide, but actually going through it in different steps that are relevant to them. And this is just one example, which is a pedagogical intervention that was introduced in law. And all of this is actually adopting a perspective of augmentation. So this is the design approach where we are investigating where existing good practice is. So, the instructors were already using a lot of these writing practices. So for instance, giving exemplars or, giving sample, asking them to do self-assessment and so forth. But where learning analytics is actually helping strengthen that practice. So by giving it a little bit of platform or a tool to be able to run it. So it's not a drastic revolution or things that have completely changed their practice, but it's actually augmenting it. And that obviously has a lot of uptake in terms of bringing it with educators as well as students. And the whole pedagogy and all of the design is co-designed with instructors. So the design of the feedback, the UI, and everything in the tool, as well as the activities that the students do, everything is co-designed with the instructor. So they know they have agency to do what is relevant for their students. And this I mean, I only showed you one context where it was implemented, so that's the law essay context, but it's actually been implemented across several different contexts across UTS, because this is a multi-year project, and it's such a big team effort. Our 2020 paper has full details of the tool and its evaluation. We also have other members who have worked on this tool later. So you can see there's a mix of like researchers as well as educators in this whole design and evaluation of AccuWriter. And it's been also evaluated in different sense. I'm not going through the details of it, but basically different measures of usefulness, how useful students found the tool. Did we actually see improvements in their writing after using the tool, so forth, and different analytics out of it. Again, in terms of revision, we're able to write with better rhetorical moves and so forth. So those are all descriptions given in the paper. And obviously I talked about that one context. So you can design it in like a million ways, depending on whichever suits the particular context. And this one in particular, I want to highlight because this was designed for critical engagement with tools like AccuWriter. And this is detailed in a 2022 paper, which was around cultivating critical engagement as automated feedback literacy. So the main argument is that we don't want students to just take the tool, whatever it says, apply it and agree and take that forward. We actually want them to think about it pretty critically, because those tools can also make mistakes. It can say that I can't find a summary move in your writing, but in fact, it might have just missed it. And those AI tools and systems are very likely to make mistakes. So one way learning design can actually help is actually design with those in mind, so that students can use it as a bit of a learning opportunity. So in this case here, students were actually asked to see if they agree or disagree. So they were given the right to disagree with the feedback. So if you disagree with the feedback, highlight what AccuWriter should have picked that you shouldn't, that you think it has missed. So it's giving students this kind of additional opportunity to engage with it more critically, where they are thinking, okay, these are ones that it has highlighted, but I feel like this is missing something. I clearly have a summary statement here. It's not there. And again, asking them to think about feedback itself, if they agree or disagree and so forth. So again, I think this was from an accounting context. So there are so many different kinds of activities we can design to go along with the tool. So the tool or the technology is a part of it, but it's not the only way we can actually help learners learn a concept or develop their skills. So implications for learning analytics, the CLAD and the way we design these systems and map or try to balance the scalability and contextualization. What it does is it helps make those systems and designs more malleable to the needs of the educator. You can see that the educator has had a role in defining even the kind of feedback that the student should receive. And for learning design, it actually improves adoption and relevance to those learning contexts. So a bit of that balance and how that comes through in this design. Okay, so and I want to just touch upon ethics as well, because it's a core part of learning analytics. I almost feel like we cannot not talk about ethics when we talk about learning analytics. So this one is to say how the ethical use of the tool was by design. So obviously a lot of the work we did initially earlier when we were trying to test out if the tool works or not was research processes. So obviously we had to go get consent for students to use it, but it's also integrated with the classrooms in some sense. But this is an interesting example of the different kinds of very little dilemmas or the microethics that happened in the design of the tool, because even very minor things like thinking about if the tool should give feedback on grammar. It might feel like it's not a big deal, but there are actually a few key decisions that kind of came across, which could maybe involve like developer effort, but also like, is that a feature that we want to target? Is it disadvantaging writers of some sort? So there are a lot of nuances that go in the design of those tools and how we implement them. So if you're interested in that, that's a good paper, a reference paper as well, which Simon was leading. And again, AccuWriter was started as a project. So it's a very little, not a little project. Obviously, there's a huge team and effort behind this project, but it started small with small teams and PhD students and staff and so forth, but then translated into a product, which is quite rare in the edtech stuff. And we talk about that a little bit when talking about the ecosystem for intelligent writing assistants in a more recent kind of reflection. We talk about how the different things like the infrastructure of the existing things, what different social factors, especially the learning design stuff and everything actually has an impact on how these products can work over time. Okay, so this is just a whole list of different design features one might consider when designing tools like these for writing. But I'll want to pause there, and because this feels like a little bit of a transition to a different thing. So because right now it feels like AccuWriter is a legacy system. In fact, it was, because a lot of those features that it used to have are very easily now done by a lot of Gen AI tools. I can just ask ChatGPT to say, okay, can you pick all of the spells moves on this document? And it's just going to give it, right? So we need different kinds of thinking about how we can support learners and writers, for instance, around this new kind of era. But I wanted to highlight what I think is quite different in terms of the affordances it gives and also potentially the challenges. So one thing I see is, it's actually initiated a lot of learner initiated feedback, which means that, the students are in charge, or they take initiative to go and find tools that can support their learning or writing and so forth. Whereas a lot of the previous instructions were quite nicely designed, very thoughtfully by an educator in mind. So for instance, this is a tool you can use for a purpose. We define particular activities and so forth. But this just opens up, right? So the learners are just open to use any kind of tool which they have available, which requires new forms of digital and AI literacy, and not everyone might have that level that's needed to be able to engage with it critically. So that's a challenge, but there's also potentially something to work on in learning design. But the second one is it also provides a lot of opportunities for personalization and scaffolding. And I like to think of it as something that goes beyond augmenting traditional practices. So, in the last bit, I talked about how we can augment some of the best practices in education that educators are already doing using some of the learning analytics tools. But we now have these kinds of new affordances where we were never able to give this kind of personalized, tailored support, which is adaptive to this extent in such an accessible conversational way. So you don't need to write code, you don't need to have very difficult, hard to use interfaces. There's no need for training to work with the system. You just can, talk to it like a person. So that again gives some opportunities, but also comes with challenges. So it's translates very seamlessly to this context. So with this one, this is a little bit of transition to one of my teaching contexts, because this ChatGPT came about around November, 2022, end of 2022, and we were all figuring out what it means for higher education. Students are all going to be using these tools. So how does our assessment change? How do we, help learners build different sort of competencies, maybe, and so forth. So what I did was thinking at that time was, we cannot simply ban or evade Gen AI. So that's just not going to be helpful, because whether or not we let them use it, they're going to use it on their own because they're so available, widely used across them. And it's just going to create a divide between some more competent and less competent learners. So we need to give agency for them to learn to critically engage with AI. And that learning to engage with AI would be one essential skill for those future learners. So this is from my particular subject. What it did was basically help let students use ChatGPT or any kind of generative AI tool for a particular kind of assessment that they were doing. Not all kinds of assessment, but this particular task where they were asked to do a critical summary and like a visual map of ethical issues in NLP. It was quite relevant because I was actually teaching them about natural language processing tools and systems. So they were learning about large language models and so forth, and they had to research about the ethical implications of them. And and they were able to use Gen AI for it, so they could learn to do better research, reflect on it, writing, learn to write better, information seeking. So there are different kinds of learning objectives in there in this particular task, and encourage them to use ChatGPT, to use like a starter for their writing, some high-level guidelines given, and but they were asked to submit their ChatGPT prompts and responses. Obviously, they may not have given everything. This is still a little bit out of our control, but that was, but they know that they would not be punished for using those tools. And this was all in the wild, so there's no control over what we do there. We're just asked to experiment and do it, and it's a little bit of an experiment for us as well as educators. We were grappling with this kind of new space. Then how do we know if students are using AI critically? And so we did a bit of research around this work where we're looking at students' engagement with ChatGPT and tools like this for their writing. And again, not going to go into the details of it because they're in the paper, and I'll be sharing the slides later, so I'm not going to go and look at the links later. But we came up with this whole set of dimensions for critical engagement or critical interaction for working with AI. So from different phases in the writing, starting from the planning and ideation stage, for instance. So a shallow kind of interaction would be something like, asking for clarification on assignment instructions, versus someone who used it in a more, in a deeper manner, might ask for a very specific ask in terms of reference to a genre or a structure. Similarly, for information seeking, which is basically searching for information, they could just ask for elaboration, which is a little bit of a superficial kind of engagement, versus they can ask a little bit more details around more questions, expansion, elaboration, and so forth. So again, and many different dimensions of feedback. So again, one thing that came up with, again, preliminary findings was we actually manually coded for those interactions and those dimensions. And all of the shallow ones are actually in blue, which you can see are predominantly highlighted. And then the orange ones are actually absent. So the green ones are the deep interaction. You can actually see the deep interactions are very, very low. So predominantly a lot of them were quite shallow. And it's kind of expected because we didn't explicitly design for their learning to better engage with it. We were pretty much asking them to do things in the wild. So students definitely need more scaffolded learning design with generative AI tools to be able to use it more critically and be able to, make the most of their learning. So another tool, let me see if I have time. Yeah, so another tool which I introduced more recently, the last couple of semesters, is something which gives more scaffolded instructions and an activity. So again, this is a tool called InfoNavigate, which was developed by one of my PhD students, Ajani, and again, the paper has details of this particular tool. So it uses generative AI, but it uses it slightly differently. So again, it's aligned with two learning objectives for a very particular task. So students were asked to research on these diverse perspectives of ethics. And in this process, they also have to experiment and learn with generative AI. And both of them. And this rethinks the usual search process. So usually when you go and find something on Google, hopefully people are still using search engines and not taking all of the answers from ChatGPT. But there's a whole list of things that comes up in a Google search or any search engine search. And the most common interaction in these is to pick the very first link and, okay, I read this and this is the most reliable link. right? So this is to rethink the way to interact with such sources, to look for more diverse perspectives, because ethics is also a subject where it's very hard to find right or wrong answers in it, unless it's very clearly wrong. It's a bit of an ethical dilemma many times to see why it's ethical or not ethical. So this particular tool looks like this. Again, I'm likely not going to the details of it, but it lists a lot of sources. So like 5 sources here, instead of just engaging with one top source, students can engage with multiple sources at a time, and they can see the difference in perspectives. So for instance, this particular source, Game of Thrones creator and authors, so ChatGPT. So this is a very particular kind of perspective, which is quite negative, versus someone else, another source compared side by side might have a very different perspective, which could be quite positive, and they might encourage it. Again, so it was not just introducing the tool, it was also involving a number of activities and an intervention. So students were asked to engage with this particular topic that they're learning as part of the subject, but it's ethical to use publicly available data to train LLMs. But then the part 1 and part 2 and part 3 are different kinds of activities. So they first rate their knowledge of the topic first, explain their current stance. So it's helping them think about their current kind of thinking before they get introduced to any of the information. And then they are introduced to this tool and this intervention. And then they're asked to identify the arguments which are for and the arguments which are against the topic, and then try and come to a conclusion. So it's not just synthesizing the information that they find, but they also have to develop their own opinion about what they think and why. And then the final one is just like some evaluation stuff. So this is, again, very much mapped to the CLAD. In fact, I've only thought about it as I was putting the slides together, that it's actually a very clear way of how CLAD works, even with the generative AI example here, with the Gen AI tools, how the features and feedback have aligned really well with the kind of task design and the assessment that they're doing anyway, which is about presenting an argument map and writing a very critical reflection of it. So that's, again, some preliminary findings about how students found it useful, how it helped recognize some nuances in the topic, and it helped to rethink their stance. So some students said it actually helped them change their stance completely, whereas like my initial position has changed quite a bit, which is quite significant if you think about it. People don't change their opinion very easily. But also a few others have reported that while it remained the same, it definitely widened their perspectives. They just have a lot more rationale and justification. And the other thing the tool was also showing was where it came from, the source. So obviously, if it came from some institution like OpenAI, which have a particular tendency to promote a particular thing like LLM sourcing information, that's going to favor a thing. So you're also noticing things like how these sources have these nuanced differences in why they have these things. All right, so that's how this kind of generative AI example has kind of flowed through from what we saw in the learning analytics example. And because of the interest of time, I'm going to just go through a little bit of provocation and stop there to think about the role of learning analytics again, to pause and think about its current role in the generative AI era. So is it a little bit obsolete, or is it more relevant now? Because closing the loop through feedback is something that learning analytics offers as a particular use case and an opportunity and an affordance. And we do have a lot of process analytics and learning analytics. So what if we can use this kind of analytics for learner self-regulation, right? So helping learners think about how much they engage with AI, for instance, how critically they engage with AI or lack of criticality. And if we are able to feed it back to the learner, that could help them become more accountable for their work, being aware of their learning, and bring some metacognitive awareness through this feedback. So it's not just about facilitating the learning design, but also how we can inform learning design back by looking at the analytics and how students are actually engaging with these tools. All right, I'm going to stop now because we might need to take some questions. So I'm gonna skip that. I'm not gonna go through these examples, but this was my last slide because we know that there are some known pitfalls when working with AI more recently, because students can offload quite a lot of tasks to AI, but there's also some quite exciting possibilities for AI learning analytics. So I showed some instances where learning analytics might help, but again, so the grounding in good learning design could be something which can help us strike this balance between the pitfalls and the opportunities. So I'll stop there and open for questions. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Shibani. You've really given us a lot to think about, and I'm so glad that you have, mentioned all that. Still, really, when it comes to learning analytics, and even now, Gen AI, we're seeing that the learning design is still really a key part of the whole thing. We can't just the main point being that we can't just throw tools at students and expect them to use it in a very effective way to help them learn. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I don't have questions in the chat, but Kenneth has noticed that when you're talking about that critical use of Gen AI, that some students were actually, he found it interesting that the students were actually using Gen AI for self-reflection. Are you able to say a little bit more about that?
So this self-reflection part of it was actually something we prompted them to do. So what they reflected in terms of so how would they reflect about their own experience? And that's where we saw differences in how some students did it in a more deeply. Like they were able to talk about how if I engaged with it, if I keep using it, I'm going to lose all my skills in writing. So they are able to actually recognize some of those limitations and talk about those deeply, versus some others which were more, like surface level, like, I thought about using it, it's good. So those are the kinds of differences we see. But apart from that, students are also using it for writing reflections. I do observe that from my teaching experience, so I can actually see some clear differences if there are reflections are written from AI. But there are also ways it can provoke them to reflect deeply. So hopefully those are also scaffolding and learning with the right learning design scaffolds and tools. We can help them reflect more deeply, because it's also a complex thing for students to do. Many students, in fact, struggle to write reflections. They don't know what kind of questions to answer. So maybe it's a tool for provoking reflection as well.
And it's really interesting that, from your range of the different ways that students actually engage, it shows that students don't use the tools in the same way. So that itself is like, it's really telling. So there needs to be guidance. Michael, you have a very nice, long question, a very thoughtful question. Can I actually invite you to share your question from your perspective and in your voice?
Sure. So I think basically this comes off the back of me studying a bit of critical pedagogy. And you can read about this in my assignment if you want, Lisa, because I sort of went on this tangent here where I was like, well, most of the Accurata and data analytics toolkits are really, how can we get the teacher to have more control over the analytics for the student? But on the converse, in critical pedagogy, they talk about the teacher-student contradiction, which is if the teacher's always in charge and the teacher decides what's right and wrong, the students don't have agency, and that perpetuates potential for, normalization, yada, yada, yada. So that made me think about how can we give the students more control over the analytics? But then, of course, I've also had this side tangent of like, well, that actually could be really dangerous because, as you say, they don't have the same criticality with it. And I don't know, they could perpetuate those same things within the class anyway. So I guess I'm interested in what kind of spaces there are. I noticed the adaptive squared learning framework somewhere in one of the readings. And that seemed like a good way to start that process.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation, Michael. And I think a lot of tools do tend to focus on teacher because the teacher tends to design the learning activities, and there seems to be quite a bit of control for the teacher. But there's also learner-centered approaches or student feedback ones, many times where the tools sometimes don't even report back to the educators. They're mostly like student dashboards or something for them to reflect on and self-regulate. And it's actually part of the slides I didn't cover, where there's a possibility of thinking about analytics, where we can actually help give those analytics as a source for student self-regulation, for instance. So this is not informing the educators, but for them to be thinking about, for instance, am I using too much AI? Am I doing, is like 75% of my writing actually coming from AI and so forth, but it's not a detection kind of tool, but it's mostly something that's going to help students formatively think about their own skills. Another example that comes to my mind is Judy Kay's work around, I think, scrutinizability that they call. So the kinds of student models that the model define, they actually give agency for the student to say, this particular information about me or the way you've described this model is wrong, or they can actually change the model. So those are called scrutinizable models, and there's quite a lot of work around that, where they're giving agency for students to define what kind of data goes on about them, if it is actually representative of their learning and thinking, because sometimes the analytic proxies may not be actually reflective
Accurate.
of their actually learning or their thinking, or because there's also so many contextual factors that happen behind, like that we have no idea of. We're just simply collecting the traces of what we can observe, right? So yeah, there's some work around those, where yeah, students are given some more agency to be able to correct their data or to adapt it to make sure it's actually representative of their thinking and their reasoning. And I want to also highlight some of the more recent approaches, which is around from Mohammed Sakur's work. They talk about person-centered and person-specific approaches, which is kind of the move beyond quantitative summaries of student cohorts to tracking every individual student's journey or helping them at an individual level. Because most times those averages and the means are not representative of anyone because they're big averages. But what if we can help like a single student track their journey instead, or like a group of them? So yeah, I just encourage you to read that a little bit more, because those are just developing some of those developing work around person-specific approaches and centric approaches, which tend to focus a lot more on the student. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy for you to link those. I don't think I can remember the authors' names. Muhammad was one of them, and maybe Julie.
Yeah, Judy Kay. Yeah, I'll post the links to those ones. You can find.
I'll probably read them much later. I've got a lot on my plate. Assignment submitted. Let's not open another rabbit hole.
It's a really important point coming up to that tension, like we say that we're giving students agency, especially in terms of self-regulated learning. Oh, we want them to be self-regulated, which means that, they can have control over their actions. But really, I think you highlighted something important, which is like, but actually we're telling them to do all these things. So how much agency do they actually have in the end, which may also explain why that lack of alignment draws them towards finding an easy way to get these things done, perhaps through Gen AI. But yeah, this is important. So how do you balance that agency, and how do we use learning analytics to help them be aware? I think that's the thing, to be aware of how they're learning, and to take control of their learning a little bit more. Yeah.
One thing I'm also recognizing that Michael raised, which is pretty interesting, is that what if students don't use it well, or they might be having some misconceptions, or sometimes they don't know why it's actually good, because they may not have the theoretical foundation and why it's designed in a certain way, right? So
if
not
they feed the
everything
model
that they say
here,
is good too. Yeah, so there's definitely a bit of tension there around designing for students, to what's best for students.
Yeah, and that's where learning Analytics comes in again. So what's the role? I think, Shibani, you were asking the important question, what's the role of learning analytics? And earlier you also asked, what's the distinction between like Gen AI and learning analytics? So I think when you're talking about this, it just, made me realize again that learning analytics, I think the premier mission, it was really to understand, gain insight into students' learning so that they can be supported. But so what's different for Gen AI is that it doesn't give us that automated, it doesn't automatically give us that insight into students' learning. And this is where learning analytics needs to be built into these tools. And so there's a lot of work now, I think, trying to marry the two together. Like how can Gen AI help learning analytics, perhaps in terms of processing data quicker or things like that, but also how Gen AI can be augmented by learning analytics by making sure that the learner gets information, for example, about how they're using the tool and making sure that they are always self-regulating, so like their awareness of how they're using the tool. Is it good for them? Is it effective for their learning? And things like that. Yeah, so yeah, really important to keep that in mind. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I just dropped those links in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I saw those.
I just have one question because I know that you have been doing so much, like this research on AquaWriter was carried out over a number of years, and you've also gathered a lot of feedback from students about how they felt about AquaWriter. So what do you feel is the most important impact of AquaWriter for students? Yeah.
So I think we measured it in very different ways at different levels, but the key thing is actually an awareness of even a thing called rhetorical moves, for instance, or there are particular ways you can structure your writing to make it more readable for a user or to make it more coherent and so forth. Because a lot of these times they're not explicitly taught about this in writing. And the same for educators, right? We don't have expertise in linguistics, for instance. We don't have expertise in writing. So maybe they are subject experts. So I might be an expert in data science, but I don't know how to teach writing. So this is where these tools are really useful for them, because there's these key concepts they can bring from those well-known pedagogies and designs of theories into how it marries to their particular discipline or practice. So the key thing was it for them to learn how to write better for their own discipline in their own disciplinary context, but by also learning those kind of specific things they can do to improve their writing, like for instance use discourse markers or or those moves, rhetorical moves in their writing. And we used to see a lot of these improvements in student writings with the before and after in some of the revision tasks that we give. And our educators, even we have some quotes from the interviewers saying, the essays were like suddenly all better, like suddenly we're getting so much improved grades. And sometimes it's not just the grades, like I get much less remarking, requests because students now understand what was missing. And that's a really good improvement because they can actually evaluate their writing and learn about it a little bit better. Yeah.
So the key thing is really that they are learning. They're not just using the tool to get some quick fixes, but they're actually learning something.
Not just
really
grammar check and agree and accept it and not think about it.
That's
They're
right.
actually through that process. Yeah.
That's right. So important. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we have a comment from Deborah. Deborah, this is like your voice. So would you like to share, your own voice on this?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think I'm very pragmatic. So my assignment was based around three kind of aspects that we had evaluated for a course that we're conducting, which is the Australian Defence College preparation course. And they hadn't done reflections on the prep course, but they had to do reflections in the the courses that they attend at the Defence College. And so when I heard that this was reflections, which would they need to add to our prep course, and academic writing, which they only teach the very simplistic kind of academic writing, this really pricked my ears, because I thought, what a perfect platform. So I have put it up to the defence, to our defence, I guess, learning branch or technologies, and asked them what needs to be the parameters behind a endorsed prototype or an endorsed platform or plugin, and they're getting back to me. But from your end, how would I go about acquiring such a this AC writer?
Okay, so I think this one is particularly about AccuWriter. So with AccuWriter, I should say, Deborah, this it's a little bit of a legacy tool now. So it was obviously like being used, tested. It's still, I think, available for students in UTS at UTS to use, but some of the feedback features and all of it are a little bit outdated now, because like I said earlier, a lot of those AI tools can do it. But what's helpful from the AccuWriter work is the kinds of underlying theories and evaluations, and those we can build from. So for instance, AccuWriter also had a whole module on reflective writing. So I didn't actually get to talk about it because my focus, and this was part of work from my PhD, was around academic writing.
Yeah.
And with the reflective writing, for instance, I'll drop a link to that again. They did a whole heap of research around what good reflective writing is, the different aspects of it.
Yeah.
What are the frameworks that can help us scaffold writing, but also measure good reflective writing? So I think what's helpful for us to use is probably take some of those kinds of theoretical frameworks and the kinds of reflective moves, for instance, and then try and apply it using a generative AI tool. Because if we prompt any kind of tool right now with LLM, it's actually able to pick up kinds of like what the rhetorical moves are, for instance, or what are the reflective moves, and it can provide feedback. I think AccuWriter, as such, we haven't yet developed it to its Gen AI version. It's in the pipeline. So I think Simon Buckingham and others at Connected Intelligence Center are looking to kind of do a revamp of it to see if it can fit to a generative AI kind of version. But I think currently what we have is a slightly older legacy version, which might not be really usable at this stage. It's helpful to just use some of the over-the-shelf tools, but use some of our theoretical principles and so forth to help guide those tools until we have a Gen AI version of AccuWriter, I guess.
Oh, okay. So it's yeah. So we can't really pursue it at the moment, really, because it's not like a what do you call it, commercial product.
Yeah. I think it's
Or
still
for
accessible
UTS.
to UTS students, but probably
not for wider. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. At least I know not to pursue that anymore, but definitely love to be kept in the loop about it, because I think it's a nice stepping stone also into AI use, because basically the topic they're going to be introduced is the ethical use of AI. Because again, like I've been listening to what you're saying about they're going to use it anyway, right? So let's show them how to use it ethically, especially for international students who do have all that head knowledge, like you said, but they don't necessarily know how to put it in English style, teal, type academic writing. So yeah, really, really loved listening to you.
Thank you.
I think, Deborah, you might find AI actually I've used it occasionally for this kind of thing. I tried to use it in a classroom to get students to write a description of a adaptation in science, whatever. And I gave the AI the rubric I wanted it to mark it against. And it actually did a relatively okay job. So you might be able to do something like that, where you get a rubric and you literally prompt AI with the rubric, and then after that get the students to upload or to type it in.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think we definitely need to do something like that so they can get a feel. And even if we get them to, like highlight you know, when they finally get their writing, they could highlight the areas where they feel it's reflective. So they're actually learning and researching that themselves, or learning by practice. So, yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, that was a really nice discussion. Really good to be able to to think about these. This is a really deep level thinking about how we actually implement these tools. So that's important as well. Yeah. It's now about 8 minutes past the hour. I think we can end here if no one has any other questions. But Crunch students, if you are still needing to have a chat about the subject, I will stay around. But in the meantime, maybe we can give Shibani our thanks. So thanks so much for coming and spending your time to give us and share with us from your knowledge about learning analytics and specifically writing analytics, and how it fits in with this whole issues of learning design. And again, we can't talk about learning analytics without talking about ethics. It has been just touching everything, so that's really important as well. So glad that you brought that out. Thank you, Shibani. I'll
Thanks
stop
so much,
recording now.
Michelle. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for joining.